So today, we're diving into something that's a real paradox at the very heart of American law, the Second Amendment. It was originally written to be this final shield for liberty, but here we are in the 21st century, and that original purpose, well, it's facing a pretty profound crisis. Let's get into why.
And this question, man, it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. I mean, think about it. With hundreds of millions of guns in civilian hands, a tool specifically intended to be a check on government overreach, why don't we see it being used for that original political purpose? The answer, as you'll see, is way more complex than you might think.
And that gap is just massive when you put the original vision side by side with today's reality. The 18th century idea was all about stopping tyranny, right? It was about balancing a citizen force against a professional army and, crucially, preserving the right to physically resist when the state acts unlawfully. Fast forward to today, and the amendment's main legal function is all about individual self-defense. The government has an unbelievable firepower advantage, and that old right to resist, it's pretty much been replaced by a wall of legal immunity for officials.
Look, this isn't just some abstract academic debate. To really see how this disconnect plays out in the real world, we've got to look at a tragic series of events that brought this whole conflict into razor-sharp focus, the Minneapolis incidents of 2026.
Okay, so you had this big federal operation. They called it Operation Metro Surge. And during it, federal agents shot and killed multiple American citizens right on the street. Now, two names you really need to remember here are Renee Good and Alex Pretti. And Pretti's case in particular, because he was a legal, licensed gun owner, sent absolute shockwaves across the country. His death forced everyone to confront this constitutional paradox head-on.
So you gotta ask, how on earth did we get to a point where federal agents could kill a legal gun owner and spark a national crisis like this? To understand that, we have to rewind. We have to go back to the beginning and really look at what the Second Amendment was designed to be in the first place, what the founders saw as their freedom shield.
All right, so the key historical argument here is something known as the insurrectionist theory. The idea is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly radical. The right to bear arms wasn't just about hunting or protecting yourself from criminals. No, its main political purpose was to give the people a final, last resort to resist a government that had gone off the rails and become tyrannical.
You have to remember, the people who wrote the Constitution were terrified of a standing army, a permanent professional military. They had seen it happen in history, and they viewed it as a potential tool for a dictator. So, what was their solution? The well-regulated militia, which was just made up of ordinary armed citizens who could be called up to defend the state. They believed that this armed populace was the ultimate check on federal power.
But here's the thing. That original purpose, that idea of pushing back against tyranny, it's been completely reshaped over the last 200-plus years of legal changes. The law itself started to shift, and it fundamentally changed the amendment's purpose from being about a collective political right to a much more individual one.
For the longest time, for most of American history, courts basically said the Second Amendment was about being in a militia for the common defense. But then, 2008, a case called D.C. v. Heller comes along and just changes everything. The Supreme Court affirmed that yes, the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own a gun for self-defense, completely separate from any militia service. Now, while this was a huge win for personal gun rights, it also had the effect of legally sidelining that original political anti-tyranny function.
Okay, but here's the really wild part. At the exact same time the Supreme Court is confirming an individual's right to own a gun, another right was being quietly taken apart. The right to actually use it against unlawful state action. For centuries, going back to English common law, citizens could legally resist an unlawful arrest. But starting in the 1960s, a legal movement basically said, nope, you have to comply first, and then you can challenge it in court later. The message was unmistakable. Your right to resist on the street was vanishing.
Okay, so if you can't resist on the street anymore, your only option is the courts, right? Well, that's where we run into a whole series of powerful legal shields that have led to a near-total collapse of accountability, especially for federal agents.
Trying to get justice after something goes wrong with a federal agent, it's like being thrown into a legal black hole. It's basically a three-step trap. First, you try to sue the agent directly, but a legal rule called the Bivens Doctrine has been shrunk so much that it almost never works. So step two, you run smack into qualified immunity. This protects an officer unless their exact action was already ruled illegal in a case that's almost identical. It's a classic catch-22. And finally, if you try suing the government itself, your case usually gets tossed because of all these exceptions in federal law. It is truly a black hole for accountability.
And this isn't just legal theory. This brings us right back to what happened to Renee Good and Alex Pretti in Minneapolis. Renee Good, an unarmed mother, was shot and killed. Video showed her driving away from an agent. Alex Pretti, an ICU nurse and a legal gun owner, was shot from behind after agents had already disarmed him, had already taken his firearm. And despite crystal clear video in both cases, the outcomes were chillingly similar. The agents were completely shielded from any real accountability. And after all this, the government's official statement, well, it was just chilling. A White House spokesperson actually said that any citizen holding a weapon while facing law enforcement must be aware they are assuming the risk of being targeted with deadly force. Just let that sink in for a second. The government's position was that the very act of exercising your constitutional right meant you were accepting the risk of being killed for it. So you can imagine the killings, the legal roadblocks, that frankly insane statement from the White House. It all boiled over into this massive crisis, and it forced everyone to ask a really fundamental question. Is the Second Amendment still a shield anymore, or has it somehow become a trap?
And the death of Alex Pretti, a guy who did everything by the book, a legal gun owner killed by federal agents, that was the spark that lit the fuse. But what happened next was not what anyone expected. It didn't unite the gun rights community against the government. Instead, it completely fractured it, shattering political alliances that had stood for decades.
You could see the cracks forming immediately. The FBI director comes out and tries to justify the shooting, saying that Pretti's extra magazines were somehow illegal at a protest. The National Association for Gun Rights fires right back, calling that logic a backdoor attempt to ban magazines. And even the NRA, which is traditionally a huge ally of law enforcement, came out and said that lawful citizens are not legitimate targets just for being armed. The old allies were suddenly fighting each other.
And that brings us to the biggest paradox of all. Just look at this number. There are over 400 million guns in the United States. That's more than one for every single person. The physical tools for resistance, the very things the founders envisioned, are more plentiful than ever before. And yet their original political function, to act as a check on the power of the state, has been almost totally neutralized by modern firepower, by surveillance, and by this legal maze of immunity. So all of this leaves us with one really uncomfortable question to chew on. If exercising your right to bear arms actually puts a target on your back, if the state has all the real power, and if its agents can't be held accountable, is that right still a shield for your liberty? Or has it turned into something else entirely, a kind of trap, a justification for the very state violence it was meant to prevent? It's a question that really cuts to the core of what the Second Amendment even means today.